All right, welcome, Terry. I'm so glad to have you on Queerly Beloved. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation. So before we get into all the juiciness of, I don't know, goblins and elves and fairies and the excitement of your book, Tyranny of the Fae, I'd love for you to tell the listeners who you are in this moment, but to do so by describing the perfect drag avatar that embodies that.
Yes, I feel like in this moment, full disclosure, I have ADHD and my medication ran out today. So my brain is very scattered. So
Okay.
I imagine I'm a drag queen that can't keep track of what she's wearing. So probably a little bit of mixed styles
Okay.
throughout. Um, I imagine the hair is sticking up in all directions, but like in very specific directions, if that makes sense. Like there's a braid here, there's like a bun over here, and then like a long straight hair over here. Um, then I imagine the makeup looks pretty sloppy because I'm also very tired at this moment.
Hmm. Well, thank you for that. And that will give me a heads up on how I might conduct this interview if we get unfocused.
Oh,
And
you keep
it's
me on track. I'll stay on track.
absolutely, and it's wonderful for you to show up exactly as you are. So I love the messy hair. I love the messy makeup. It is its own version of beauty and fabulosity, and it is very welcome here. So thank you for showing up exactly as you are. I'll just share for me, I've been very low energy the last few days. It's been a lot of activity in my life, a big event for my mom's birthday, and then a San Diego Gay Men's Chorus performance, and a lot of other stuff in between. And so I'm coming off that, and I've been so low energy. But then today I took this yoga class, and I'm like finally in my energy, and I feel like a train just went by. I feel like a train. I feel like my drag avatar isn't a train though. I'm gonna say my drag avatar is like sort of like this Liza Minnelli type character, like Liza when she's like the drag queens who do her like all sped up, like she's got like her little black wig on and she's like got her bright red lips and she's just like excited and like moving quickly. So that's my drag avatar for today.
Yeah, I love that for you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I am excited to talk about the world of dragons and goblins and fae and elves. And I just would love, because it's a world that I love. Like my favorite movies are the Lord of the Rings, and I love reading fantasy novels that bring me into that world. And I'm just curious what your connection is to that world. What is it about that world that has been appealing to you to explore?
Yeah, whenever I was growing up, I always gravitated towards like sci-fi fantasy stuff, superhero stuff, all of these, like anything that's sort of fantastical was always appealing to me. And I remember a time in my life whenever like I wouldn't read books if they didn't have some element of like magic or sci-fi. It's like why am I reading this if there's no magic or robot in it? Like what is the point of it? I've gotten over that, as an English major and stuff. But I still have a preference for that stuff. And I think it's just sort of an escape into a different world, into a place that's different than ours. And I think that it's nice to have, this you can still see problems, you can still address things in the real world, but it feels more distant. It doesn't feel as close as like a more traditional fiction novel would.
Yes. Yeah, the escape piece really resonates with me too. And it's just such an appealing world to me to escape into, like these types of characters that exist in those worlds. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on where that paradigm comes from. This specifically the world of like elves and goblins and fae and dragons and wizards. Do you have any thoughts on how that became part of our vernacular, like this type of world that we write about and that we make movies about? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's almost certainly a lot of lore and legends, right? Like the Arthurian legends come to mind. A lot of ancient Greek mythology is probably a
Hmm.
lot of inspiration for where that came from. And I mean, speaking of queerness specifically, every queer person you know is into Greek mythology, right? So I think that it's something about that is very appealing. And also I think the idea of not being as tied to the binaries of our real world, you know, whether it's gender, whether it's expression, whether it's like just what you can physically accomplish, to think that there could be no limits to that, I think is very appealing to a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. What just popped up for me is the sort of non-binary quality of fae, of elven. Often, the men are very gentle, or their features are very feminine. And then if you think of like I don't know, do there exist female goblins or female trolls, for example? It's similarly like more in a non-binary spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the interpretation. Like I definitely have, male and female goblins in my world,
Right.
but they like they are smaller and more petite than what you would think of as a traditional masculine person. But like I know plenty of men that are more petite, right?
Yeah.
In the real world. So I think that's something to do with it. I think that something specific about elves and dwarves when it comes to like Tolkien fantasy
Hmm.
that is very androgynous, because like in Tolkien fantasy, dwarves, whether you're male or female, have beards. Like the women wear beards. And
Yes.
then the elves are all like there's no facial hair on any elf, whether it's male or female. So I think that that's very androgynous to kind of like not be able to tell. There's like this custom where it's like rude to ask, if
Ah,
you're a man or a woman.
I
Which
love
is
that.
why I had canon that Gimli and Legolas, fell in love and escaped together, because they had no idea if it was, an appropriate relationship for them or not, because it was too weird to ask.
I love that. That's so great. Yeah, I was just sharing this story with some young adults that I work with the other day. We were talking about going to a Ren fair, and I went to a Ren fair with my friend Nomi, and we dressed as like fair maidens. And I had this like long blonde wig, and I, was walking around in drag, feeling, so fabulous. And there was one of those guys who was at a dunking booth and doing the typical heckling that someone at a dunking booth might do, and they started misgendering me and calling me Legolas. And in retrospect, it really wasn't an insult. I mean, I love Legolas, but it was pretty fun. This is pretty woo and far out there, but sometimes I like to imagine that world as actually existing in another dimension, and that we have this connection to it, not because we just made it up, but that there's some reality to it, and that, I don't know, that fae exists and that elves exist, and they maybe don't exist here on this plane, or maybe they do in some way. But yeah, I just want to share that and hear if you have any thoughts on that. I know it's pretty out there, but
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's a couple of ways to address that. Like when it comes to the Fae, like there is a lot of like Celtic myth that like the Fae are just they're in another plane of existence, and they are people that live among us and help us in different ways. Like the Fae are things that you're sort of like you shouldn't ever welcome into your home, because they're kind of scary entities. Like they're more powerful and different than us. I heard
mm,
somebody describe as like on TikTok, if you have like a fairy garden in your yard and they like make mushrooms grow around it or whatever, that's like a theory that you can do that. They do that not because like they love it, but it's because it's like when your mom puts a picture that you drew in kindergarten on the refrigerator. They're like, oh, how cute that this human like is making this thing that they think is what we do.
mm, that's adorable. I love that. Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. Yeah, sometimes I feel like I'm part Fae. I feel like I hold some like Fae energy, and I mean, I don't mean to like say that I need to go through my DNA and figure out where that lies, but it just feels like some strange mysterious truth that I hold. Um, so yeah, tell us a bit about Tyranny of the Fae, your upcoming debut novel, right? And maybe, since this is a podcast about queerness and spirituality, maybe you could share how your novel speaks to queerness and spirituality.
I think it does, in that it kind of isn't, which I think is actually kind of universal when it comes to queerness.
Sure.
So basically every relationship, like romantic relationship in the book, is queer It stars three women. Each women have different storylines because it's a short story collection, so we follow each of them separately, and they each have a sapphic love story of some kind in their story. Some of it's more prominent, sometimes it's sort of subtle, but they're all very clearly there. And the thing that I think makes all of them similar is that they're all seeking for adventure, or they're seeking to leave the home that they're in for something different than where they are, which I think does speak a lot to my queerness and in the way that it kind of like manifests spiritually, which is that like I'm always wanting more. I want to be like, I feel like I've never felt like I fit in where I grew up in a small town. And I think that the idea of feeling different and that I should be somewhere else has always been like a strong desire for me. I think that that's sort of manifesting in these characters.
Yeah, beautiful. I love bringing queer characters into the world of fantasy. I love, I've only read a couple books that do that. I don't know, are you familiar with was it TJ Plune? He did like
But yeah,
Lightning
it's really insane.
Strike and Destiny of Dragons. And it was so fun for me to have the world that I already love, the fantasy world, and then the queer lens on it. Was such a game changer for me, you know, having only read heteronormative stories that take place in that setting. So I think it's a real gift that you are creating that for queer readers and straight readers alike, to be able to see themselves in these fantasy characters. I think is a real gift.
Yeah, you know, I've intentionally thought a lot about this because I feel like a lot of writers, whenever they go to write a relationship, they think, what reason would there be for this to be a queer relationship? And that's why so many relationships in media default to like more cisgendered straight relationships, because there's not like a reason typically for a relationship to be queer. So I try to approach it from the other angle, which is like, what's the reason that this should be a straight relationship? And the truth is, very rarely are there any good reasons that it has to be straight. So like I come to it from this angle of like the default is this, and it's not like it's the default for the world, but for me it is as a writer. You know, like for me, I would prefer to write this relationship, and that doesn't mean that I'm going to exclusively ever write queer relationships, but I think that it makes my stories different in a way that is more appealing to people like us because we can see ourselves reflected more clearly in it.
I love that. And why shouldn't queer relationships be a default? I think that you're absolutely right. That when we see queer stories in major media, it's there's like a point to it. There's like a reason, you know, there's like some angle to it. And like, why can't it just be matter of fact? So I love that you're really shifting the energy in the way that you're approaching it. So I know that you had some challenges around organized religion growing up, and I'm curious if you could share a little bit about that, how your connection to spirituality has played out.
Yeah, so as I said, I lived in a small town for much of my life, and my mom made it a priority to take us to like our Christian church. So a Church of Christ, so it's like very, very conservative. And you know, like I had a positive experience as a kid, like, you know, because it was a community, we had fun activities, things like that. But as I got older and as I realized more about myself and also about the world, you know, like it, especially as I was like in college, I could only go to a sermon where the preachers talked about how being gay was a sin every sermon so many times before it got very grating on me. And I just, you know, like I just couldn't keep doing it. So eventually I just sort of started stepping back and exploring spirituality on my own. I went to some other Christian churches that are more welcoming, and that was very affirming to kind of like see this environment where the thing that I grew up learning and worshiping wasn't as rigid. But then I also took a lot of classes in college about religion and like especially like the major religions, so like Muslim, Judaism, a lot of the Judeo-Christian stuff. And it's been very eye-opening. Like there's this theory in the Muslim religion that basically every prophet, so like in every religion, right? Buddhism, Hindu, whatever, all of them are valid from the same like higher power. And obviously in Muslim it's Allah, like who we would think of as the Christian God still. But I like to think, as somebody who has become a little bit more spiritual, a little bit more woo, that what if it's not, you know, the Christian God? What if it's kind of like a higher power? What if it's various spirits that control the universe? What if it's kind of just like the idea of the universe, you know? And I
Mm.
think that that's something that has been helpful for me, is to kind of like be a little more um less rigid about it. So I like to call myself agnostic, but like with the caveat that I still sort of believe that there is some, like, it's not that I don't not believe, it's that I do believe, I just have no idea what it is, you
Yeah,
know?
beautiful. Yeah, I also embrace that, and often I pray to great mystery, or I like to talk about the altar of maybe, that so much of it is this what if. In the same way that as I talk about the possibility of being fae, like it feels like true, and who knows if it's true. It's so impossible for us to really understand all these things because there's so much that we don't understand. And so to embrace that we know so little compared to what there is to know. And that part of that is the mystery of spirituality. It's been very comforting for me and very helpful for me, rather than feel like I need to get stringent or grasping on to specific beliefs, but just to hold them a little more loosely, and to still have faith, but to not be so hard on specifics, and to embrace the fact that it's all a what if, it's all a mystery, it's all an altar of maybe.
Yeah, and like growing up and going to church and having these very specific traditions, I still appreciate things like religious tradition.
Hmm.
But what I've learned is that I can pick and choose from different religions. It doesn't have to all come from the same place.
Hmm.
So like I've made kind of like an altar, like a Wicca style, like witch's altar next to my bed. But I've also included pictures of like family members that have passed that I was close to
Yes.
sort of represent more of like a, like a Japanese altar, or like an ofrenda from like Day of the Dead. So
Hmm.
like I'm trying to sort of like mesh these cultures together in a way that just sort of makes sense for me.
Yes, I do the same thing. And I do think that there's something really magical about bringing these different cultures and religions and customs together. Yeah, my altar has, it has like Mother Mary next to Shiva, next to Kuan Yin, next to, a Native American, or next to, a power animal. Like next to, yeah, I also have past, benevolent ancestors. And that resonates with me. There is something really beautiful about a spiritual smorgasbord. And there's something very queer about it too. The embrace of the all, really not feeling like we need to be in a box and just stick with Christian deities or Muslim deities or Buddhist deities, that we can embrace all the ones that resonate with us, and have a more queer embrace of all the possible deities that we can connect with, and learn from, and benefit from their energy.
Yeah, and I think the thing about kind of the unknown and like the maybe of it, like you had spoken about,
Mm.
I think the thing that is reassuring is like, are my past relatives still out there? I don't know, but I can still be inspired by the memory of them and the person that I knew them to be, you
Mhm.
know? So like, are they guiding me? Maybe not directly, but like they can be, like who they were to me can still be important to me, can still help me inform decisions that I make in my life.
Absolutely. And same thing with these deities or these ascended masters, that they all have stories, and they, can symbolize things. Um, yeah, which actually sort of circles us back to the power of story. Tell me about how you tapped into your knowing that you are a storyteller, and what that path has been like for you to really embrace your purpose as a storyteller.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I always loved writing stories. Like I remember in grade school, they did this contest called Take a Kid to Dinner, where all the class would write a story, then the winner would get to go to dinner with their teacher, and then they all read the stories at the dinner. I was
Oh,
always really motivated by that. I never won, but I was always like excited with the idea of it, and I always loved the stories that I wrote. And I guess when I didn't win, I was just like, well, I guess I'm not a writer, because like you think of it as a binary, like, well, if I didn't win, then I lost.
Mm.
But then, and also, I think that there's this thing that happens when you're like middle school, high school, where it's like, well, this isn't a viable career, so I can't pursue that. So I'm going to figure out something that's more viable, which I've never been successful at. But like that actual figuring out what is successful.
Mm.
So I think there was a lot of like sort of settling into what seemed like what appeared on the outside as successful, as opposed to doing the things that actually spoke to me. And
Mm.
then I opened up a comic book store like 8 years ago.
Wow.
And I did that just because it was like I was coming to some money, like my grandma would give me a chunk of money, and I was like, I can use this to try to like help the area. Like I said, small town, struggling economy. I can do something to give back to sort of like model small business and rebuilding the economy, all these things. And then I also decided to go back to college and finish up my degree. So I went to college for broadcast journalism back when I graduated high school. I ended up leaving early for credit card debt reasons, all the things that millennials struggle with.
Mhm.
And then I never finished it. So then I decided to finish up my degree as I was at the comic book store. And I went to school for English this time just because like I did want to tell stories. Like I loved writing, I loved telling stories. So I wanted to pursue that. And I felt like I didn't know where to start. I just
Mhm.
wanted to get a degree so that I could learn more about it to get there. And full disclosure, getting an English degree like a bachelor's does not tell you anything about being a writer.
Ah,
you, you read it a lot, which I think is useful because you
sure.
get to see how other people, approach it. And I took a couple of creative writing classes, but nothing about like here's the steps you take to become a professional writer.
Mm.
So after I graduated from college, the comic book store closed because I live in a small town and the economy's bad. And I jumped around to a bunch of other jobs. But then I ended up taking a master's degree program to become an English teacher. Honestly, just because I wanted to sub on the side while I was working a part-time job that didn't pay enough.
Mm.
And if I was pursuing an English education degree, then I could sub. So I was just doing that just to kind of have supplemental income.
Mm.
And then I ended up graduating just because like I was pursuing the program. And then it was like the job part-time job had ended at that point. So it's like, well, I guess I'm gonna become a full-time teacher just because like that's where my path has taken me.
Mhm.
And once I started working there, I just felt like I had to go back to being a to like pursuing the thing that I cared about. And the
Mm.
thing that really struck me was I mentioned that I have ADHD at the beginning of the interview. I was diagnosed like not that long ago, like maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Mm.
And it really struck me that I never really stuck at a job, especially a job, but even like creative pursuits, I would like eventually fall off on if it wasn't immediately successful. And I realized that that's maybe why I wasn't successful at it because I kept dropping off. And it was just sort of a symptom of the ADHD was like just sort of bouncing from one thing to the other. So I decided that I wanted to do something, anything that I could just stick with. And I
Mm.
chose writing because that was a thing that I went to school for, not that long ago.
Mhm.
And then I just wrote once a week, every week for a long time. That's how the novel happened. And
Mm.
then this book, Tyranny of the Fae, came out of a series of short stories I wrote the following year just to kind of continue writing once the novel was finished.
Nice.
So it's been, this process is kind of like exploring how to motivate myself in a way that is productive, but also that speaks to me and my method. So
Mm.
I think that learning that I'm a storyteller is really just learning that I needed to do something that made me feel fulfilled. And this was that thing.
Awesome. I love that. Congratulations on that discovery process and continuing to follow your heart and stay true to your path. I I have a book that I started writing this past summer, and it definitely has like had waves of like me putting a lot of time and energy into it and then me forgetting all about it. I'm curious about your process. What was effective for you? So you mentioned that you would write once a week. Would that be for like hours each time, or how? Yeah, how did
No,
that work?
it was a lot of this was unintentionally great for ADHD, which is like tying it to other activities.
Hmm.
So every Wednesday I'd go to a cappella choir practice like in the evening, and I had to drive pretty far away because again, small town. So I had to drive to a larger city to go to this practice. So then I would go to Starbucks after work, and I would ride at Starbucks for an hour ish,
Hmm.
and then I would go to choir practice, and it was all sort of like one tight activity. Like Wednesday was my creative mental health day, you
Nice.
know. So the writing just always happened as part of that. So it was just sort of this thing where I went outside of my environment to Starbucks. I think that was a big piece of it that made it successful, is that I wasn't confined to my home, and I didn't, it was the space I thought of as a place I work was Starbucks. So whenever I was there, it was like, well, I have to write now. That's what I do when I'm here, you know? So I think that was a big part of it. And then just kind of setting a routine where I did it regularly. And I think that that's the big key. And I think that it's advice that people get wrong, because you see a lot of writing advice that's like, you have to write every day, or you have to write 1,000 words a day, or whatever. I think you just have to have a schedule that is consistent, period. It doesn't matter how, like, what it could be once a week, it could be once a month, it could be once a year. But if you do it every time, you know, eventually something will develop.
I love that. Yeah, to me, it's about consistency, or what I'm hearing in that story, consistency and just sticking with it and getting through it bit by bit. You know, you do enough hour-long Wednesday Starbucks sessions, and suddenly you have a book. That's great.
And maybe he's just doing it for other reasons. You know what I mean? Like there were other reasons. I love what I write. I love being able to write fantasy that has representation with queer people in it. Like that's a thing that especially appeals to me. I like writing an allegory that represents our world. I like kind of like trying to present our world in a different way. But I mean, what I like about it, and the reason I think I stick with it, is that I'm doing this to sort of like propel myself forward in life in a way that just makes logical sense to me. You know, like having the schedule, and this is the thing that I pursue, and then everything I do sort of like supports this. So like, you know, I built this like the other podcast I did because it helps support my writing. Like, it's not that I do it as a podcast, just I do it as a vehicle to support writing. So I think that because like everything I'm doing kind of funnels into that, makes it seem more attainable, and also makes it seem like everything's connected and everything is worth doing, you know?
Yeah, and what I hear in that too is embracing the process, that really connecting with the pleasure of the process. You know, I was listening to your podcast episode where you were announcing that you're going on this book tour, which, congratulations, by the way, that sounds really exciting. And that it's not just about promoting the book, like you're just excited to do the tour. Like the more that we can find pleasure in our processes, the more that we aren't so focused on the outcome. And then it just creates a different energy around what our project is, that we don't need to be grinding and pushing because we want this thing on the other side, but that we can embrace what we're doing in the process. And then we do that enough, and then this thing manifests. There's something more freeing and more joyful about that experience. And it's a piece of wisdom that I need to remind myself of frequently, is that it's not so much about the outcome, and more that I can focus on the process, the more that I can bring joy to it, and often have better results, a better outcome.
Yeah, and I think that part of it too is just kind of realizing that you should do things that you need to have patience whenever it comes to this kind of stuff, you know? And I think that part of having ADHD and knowing that I have ADHD, like learning that patience was a very important part of it, and like allowing myself to accept that patience, you know? And I think that sort of like I've been told a number of times that I'm unusual when it comes to like my approach to promotion and stuff, because I have a social media person that makes videos for me for TikTok. And she was saying like, you know, you're not getting a ton of views yet. I'm really sorry about that. And I was like, oh, I don't expect a ton of views yet. Like, I'm just starting out. Like, I'm doing this tour over the summer. I feel like after I do physical promotion, that might get more momentum and stuff. And I think that sort of having a different perspective of like, oh, I've not started yet. Like, I've just started. Like, I'm barely doing anything, I think is useful, because I think that I could get in my own head a lot and say like, I've done a bunch of these podcast interviews now. I have 2 seasons of a podcast, and like I've not crossed that line where I feel like I'm like a successful author yet, but like my book is for pre-order, you know? Like I don't even have a book out yet. So I think it'd be easy to get in my own head and be like, oh, why aren't I there yet? But like I'm not supposed to be there yet, you know, I'm not done yet.
Yes. Yeah, to really, for me, it's about trusting divine timing and just remembering that I am exactly where I'm supposed to be right now. And yeah, I feel like I often have also fallen into the trap of comparing myself to the self I want to be in the future. And instead of just being who I am now with all the successes I've created now, and having faith that there is growth happening and that there is a future self that has even more expansion and more success and more notoriety and abundance and all the things that we're after, and again, it's just being focusing back on the process with some faith that you're moving towards a greater goal. Sort of like, sticking with that Wednesday hour-long Starbucks session.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, in a spirituality in the woo of it a little bit. It's about like gratitude, and it's about like keeping track of successes and things like that. Like every year I set a series of goals for myself, and I may or may not meet them. But that's not the point of the list. The point of the list is to kind of like give myself goalposts. And then whenever I can end the year and look at those goals and like 2 or 3 of them out of 10 got crossed off, that's a success.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think this sort of like accepting that you don't have to do everything, but the things that you do are still worthwhile. And also just kind of like accepting successes, because sometimes you're successful in things you're not trying to be successful in. Like I'm trying to lose weight right now for health purposes, but I don't think of it as a goal. I think of it as like a thing that I'm doing. But then when I do lose the weight, like I should celebrate that. I'd be excited about it. But then I oftentimes don't, because it's like, well, that was just a thing I did to be healthy. But like I think that sort of recognizing those successes also are important.
Absolutely. And especially when human nature has this tendency to really dissect our losses, to dissect our failures. Like how did that go wrong? Why did I do that? That the tendency is to really focus on that and not give our wins nearly as much time and energy. And my belief is that what we give energy to grows. And so when we do that, we're doing a real disservice to ourselves. And so the more that we can remind ourselves to be present with our wins, to celebrate our wins, to celebrate ourselves, to be grateful for the things that lined up in order for that win to happen, the more that we're going to focus our energy there and create more of that. So
Yeah,
you,
I think it just comes down to like, being more what's the word people are using these days? Like more conscious, more aware. What's the meditation style people use? The like, yeah, being more mindful of your surroundings in your life.
yeah, awesome. Yeah, so I know that you do some work with astrology. I'm curious how that kind of comes into all this. In what way does that
Yeah,
make?
so minor, right? Like just barely I barely touched the surface with it. But I appreciate it. Um I remember my earliest memories of kind of like dipping my toe into it. I pulled up a numerology report, like based on all my information, and it gives you like a readout of like at each age, like what you expect for each decade of your life. And in my 40s, it was like you're going to be like really successful in a creative field, and I was like, 40s don't seem so bad. Which was the first time I thought, like up until that point, I had thought about like I should be successful now.
Hmm.
Like why aren't I already successful? So like kind of having this like accepting that later is okay, I think was very useful for me. So that's sort of when I started like taking astrology more seriously. Like it was less about like having that guidance, more just about like accepting that maybe there is something to it. Maybe like just kind of accepting that, things come in their own time, and this can be like a series of like uh guideposts of like where you should go and what you could do. I think has been very helpful. So like I don't do a ton. I have like the CoStar app, all the things other people have. I've
Mhm.
subscribed to Chani Nichols, a newsletter she sends out every week, that gives you readouts for your sun sign and your rising sign. She says always read both of them because they'll give you better direction. And
Nice.
I do that every time I get one. And also like just that understanding I think was so useful, because you think of astrology as like, I think we think it's a thing where it's like it's going to tell you the future, but it's like it's not. Doesn't tell you the future. It just gives you like ideas of where there's energy and where you can kind of like best use what the universe is giving you for who you are, you know?
Yes. Yeah, I think that word mindfulness is the key word there too, right? It's bringing mindfulness to the universal energies so that we can work with them more effectively. I like to use astrology just to be more cognizant of what might be going on for me emotionally and energetically, spiritually, in the good times and the bad. And to also work with it to make the most out of the more potent times where I have the possibility of shifting my energy, of transforming, of expanding. So the astrologer that I work with has given me a lot of dates that are recommended dates for me to perform some kind of ritual or ceremony. And so I have them in my phone and I'm like reminded of them. I'm like, oh, okay, 2 days from now, it looks like I gotta figure out some kind of ceremony and then I'll do something, and sometimes it's like dramatic or sometimes it's like pretty low key, like praying, around a fire or taking a dip in the ocean. But doing it in a ritualized ceremonial way that is, inviting the release of something that doesn't serve me and the inviting in of something that I want to step more into. And so much of ritual for me is about that. It's about clearing space with stuff that's not serving me and being intentional about what I want instead, energetically and in terms of my habits, my actions, the way life is occurring for me. Yeah.
Well, also I think when it comes to astrology and also kind of the agnosticness of it all,
Mm.
like even if none of it's real, does it hurt to like for a couple weeks out of the year think about relationships and love, and then the next couple weeks think about career, then the next couple weeks think about your mental health and your spirituality? Like I think of nothing else like that division of like things that you keep in mind as your priorities is useful, whether or not anything of it is like a real thing. I think just having those like dividers is
Mm.
useful because it helps you have more of a balance in your life.
Yeah, it gives us a framework and it helps guide us in our focus. Yeah, it occurs to me, speaking to someone who's a fantasy, fiction writer, that one could maybe even perceive these ideas, these spiritual ideas from a fantasy fictional standpoint and still have the capacity to embrace them and work with them in a good way.
Yeah, I mean, I know I follow a writer on TikTok that actually has the zodiac symbols as the magic system in his world, and like
Cool.
the different zodiac signs have different like magic affinities, and that's how he like whatever sign you're born under, you have different like abilities based on that. So I think there is a lot to explore there. But I mean, like I try to think of it as like I don't whenever I write a character, I don't think like what zodiac sign is this character, like what's their rising, what's their like I don't think of it that way. But I do think of like archetypes, and I also think that when it comes to things like sun, moon, rising, those are different like aspects of who we are. And I think that whenever you think about all three of those of a person, it makes them a more complete character,
Mm.
because I think that a lot of times characters, as in life, are their sun signs, and that's all they are. And I
Mm.
think that those characters are far less interesting because they're just how they present themselves.
Mm. I love it. Yeah. So even with just astrology as a framework for creating a more comprehensive, more layered, complicated, realistic character. Love that. Mm.
Yeah, because like you can be somebody that desires wealth, but then also like wants to be loved. Like those two things can exist independently.
Mm. Yeah. And astrology can help us be aware of that and to embrace that and see it in ourselves and see it in others and then create characters that also emulate that. Mm.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited about your book and all the good things that you're up to. What else do you feel moved to share before we wrap things up here?
Yeah. So like you said, I'm going on a book tour. I'll be driving across the country. So within the next month-ish, I should be rolling out a tour schedule. I'm expecting to have like 5 to 10 like official dates. This would be like bookstore appearances, library appearances, coffee shop, whatever. And then but then I'll be in like a ton of cities beyond that because I'm just gonna be driving across the country all summer. So be on the lookout for that so you can actually meet me in person if you want to.
Yeah.
But then anybody that wants to reach out, I'll probably be in your city too because I'm going to be everywhere. But so whatever. But my Instagram is Terrlet, TRRLET, same username for TikTok. Terry Bartley on Twitter, and then Terry Bartley Writer on Facebook. And then my website is terrybartley.com. And that's anywhere you can find me. My book is coming out in August. Book is available for pre-order now. I'm actually looking for advanced readers right now. So anybody that wants to read it now, I can get a free copy by checking out my social media and applying.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. And I'll put that stuff in the show notes. And yeah, how fun. I'm so excited for you to take that cross country tour. I know cross country road trips have had significant impact on me in my life. I've had a few that have been really major moments of my journey. And so I wish you blessings on yours. I imagine it is similarly going to be full of adventures and new learnings and experiences and the wisdom that might come from that. So I wish that for you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that being by myself on the road for that long will be pretty spiritual, especially seeing, the beautiful parts of the country that I'm not usually around.
Yeah, oh, it's going to be amazing. Well, thank you so much again. It's been such a pleasure connecting with you and hearing your thoughts on all these exciting topics that I love to talk about. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.